Hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of an introduction to sociology. This week we're looking at class, the system of class and stratification. So in that we're going to be looking at inequality. So why inequality? So if we look at class as a system by which society ranks categories of people, puts people in a hierarchy, then we're immediately looking at inequality, because on the top we have people with more money and status, and at the bottom an underclass. So of course we're going to be looking at inequality when we put people in an actual hierarchy. Now there is more to a hierarchy of class and social stratification than just wealth and income. And remember, wealth and income are different things. Income is what we earn every week, and most people are living on this week to week. Some have savings, some don't. Wealth is where we're actually looking at things like property ownership of shares, that kind of thing. So wealthy people are those that own corporations, companies, businesses, and when they own property, they own things like, rows of flats in the city and business properties as opposed to one or two investment properties. So there are other factors. Now, postcode is one of them. Where do you live? Do you live in a good neighbourhood? Do you live surrounded by wealth and privilege? Or do you live in an area where most people are renting, or it's housing commission? Education levels are associated with the class system. How high is your education level? Where did you attend school or university? Even leisure activities, and we're going to look at theorists a bit later. The theorist Bourdieu talked quite extensively about how leisure activities, what we choose to do, what we consume, is very much connected to class. Our command of language is interesting. Like, what is our accent? Does our accent identify that postcode or that education level? And when we're looking at, again, Bourdieu's theories of capital, cultural capital, so if we have a lot of cultural capital, then we have more advantage in the social system. We are higher on the level of stratification. And this often isn't just about accent or your command of the language, to have a very good command of the language, but it's also about being having mastery in other languages as well. Okay, so status, which is a symbolic thing, is also important in terms of social stratification. If you have status, you have something tangible that pretty much can be traded for money. I'm always interested in when celebrities go places or attend an event or function, people give them a great deal of resources. They might give them money to travel. They might give them a whole lot of gifts for attending something. And I think it's really interesting. These people already have privilege and wealth, and yet are then gifted when they go and go to activities or social events. Okay, so class differences exist in social groups. Some groups have privilege, wealth, status, and power. So who are these? How do we understand this privilege, wealth, status, and power? And how do you get it? So members of society can be stratified on many levels, so let's keep that in mind. Class has been much maligned as a theory because of identity factors such as ethnicity, religion, your choice of religion or the religion you're born into, your ability status. Do you have a disability? Are you in some way different to the norm and that disadvantages you? And what about gender? So some feminists would say gender is much more important than class. And race theorists would say ethnicity is much more important than class. So some people, when they're looking at inequalities, ascribe to the identity theory. How do you identify and how does society identify you? But there's still a lot of traction in the class theory, that there is disadvantage in some classes and advantage in others. And also, socioeconomic status and class are considered to be different here. Now, this is more of a modern phenomena when we look at how Marx talked about class, our very first theorist in terms of understanding class, looked at it very much economically, because in those days, just coming out of the feudal system into a capitalist system with the Industrial Revolution, some people had the wealth, status, privilege and power. They also had the money. And those that didn't have any wealth or status or power didn't have any money also. So now we're in a day and age where our working class does have money. They do have an income that will give them a living wage. They are not necessarily living in poverty, whereas in the times Marx was talking, they were. So we do find that Marx's theory is relevant today in some context, particularly the global inequality context. But when we're looking at the Western world and we're looking at the working class, it is no longer the case that all working class people do not earn a living wage, for instance. But we will go more into Marx as we travel through this lecture. So inequality. Now, a concern for inequality underpins studies of society. And the whole theory of class is about inequality. When Marx first looked at class as a theory to try and understand social stratification and the abject poverty of the working class, it was coming from an ethos that inequality was wrong, that something needed to be done about it. So Marx was looking at, how do we understand this unequal system? Where is it coming from? Why does it happen? How can we change it? So very much steeped in a theory of inequality. So why do we study inequality? Well, inequality creates divisions, not only of wealth, but of assets generally, opportunities. So opportunity is quite different to wealth and assets. Assets we could also call resources. And then we have services. What services does society offer, and how do we then access those services? What are our opportunities? Is it difficult to access them because they're under-resourced and understaffed? If they're for people who are disadvantaged in society, that's often the case. Services are a lot easier to access if you do have wealth and power. Opportunities is about, what is your opportunity to do a particular job, to travel, to get a really good education, and so on. Now, access to all of these things is unequal, and that kind of access disadvantages some while advantaging others. So what are the causes of inequality? This is very much a concern. This morning I was looking at a conversation piece that was interested in how, when most of us in the Western world know that we're buying products that are very cheap from third world countries, that a lot of them are produced using slave labour. How do we justify that in our own minds? So basically we're looking at the people in the third world that produce the products are suffering from inequality. They're disadvantaged. And they're disadvantaged by our consumption patterns. So how do we then contribute to that system? So why is this inequality occurring? We're the end user. We're making it possible. So why? Why do we make it possible? Why do we not object? Why do we not say no? What was really interesting was to read everybody's comments, and there was somebody there from the Justice League who said, really, we can't put the responsibility on the end consumer. It must come from states, and it must come from businesses. So if you're buying a product made by Bonds, say, Bonds should be taking responsibility for the fact that slave labour is being used to produce its underpants. We shouldn't, as the end consumer. But other people were disagreeing and saying we've got to take some responsibility. But basically the researchers who wrote the article, they were trying to find out why. Why do we allow this inequality to exist and occur and be reproduced over and over and over? Why is it getting worse? And why are we not doing anything about it? So really interesting in that regard. And how does the inequality impact on us? Now, does it impact on us as a society? Do we have a collective guilt? Is there, in some ways, even if we are wealthy and privileged and have status and opportunities and everything, does inequality impact on us negatively? Or does it only impact negatively on those that are directly suffering it? We shall see. I love this. That's John Howard saying, in a perfect world, every child would have a better education than the others. Now, this is a comment on using competition as a way to make education better. So each education facility will compete against the others, and therefore they will all become better through that process of competition. This comment shows that it's kind of never-ending, doesn't it? That there will always be those that are better and those that are worse, because some will have more assets and wealth and opportunity than the others. So, interesting. You can really think deeply about a comic like that. So here's a question for you to think about. Class and inequality are not just about money and poverty. There are other important factors. So what are they? Are you taking notes? Are you able to just go to those notes and come back with what they are? Can you remember? Has anybody not taken notes? And, so write it down. What can you remember? A few minutes after me talking about it, what can you remember? Because, theories of education and how students learn and how they remember would say, in an hour's time you'll remember less, and in a day's time even less, and in a week's time even less. And how you remember more is to write it down and to read it later. And then you might read it again and just scan it in an hour, and then scan it again in a week, and it will go into a deeper part of your memory. So I just thought that would be interesting. What exactly can you remember? Okay, so postcode. Did anyone remember that? Where you live. So class. A certain class of people live in particular areas of Sydney or Melbourne. Where do you live? Can you identify areas in your town or your city where say the posh people live, the people with money live, or where people who are disadvantaged live? Education levels. So that'll be about how high do you go, but it's also going to be about where you got your education from. Oxford University, Harvard University. These are the elite institutions in the world. Leisure activities, as I said, Bourdieu, the theorist, he talks a lot about the leisure activities. What do you choose? Do you choose to go to a classical music concert? Do you choose to go to the opera? These are upper class choices. Even sport can be divided. What sports are associated with the different classes? What books do you choose to read? TV shows do you watch? Where do you go for a holiday? What cruise line might you choose? And does this come from, do you choose according to your class? Other people in your class choose it too. We'll talk more about that in terms of Bourdieu's theories. Again, language command. Do you have a second language, a third, a fourth? Are you proficient in the only one that you have? Sometimes disadvantaged people aren't proficient in the one language that they have, in either reading or writing or speaking. And that might hold them back if they go to job interviews, to be able to fill out forms, to converse with others, to feel confident about that. Okay, so forms of capital, social and cultural capital. Social capital is who you know. Cultural capital is something like your command of language, where you have travelled, your ability to travel. Status is symbolic capital. So somebody who, a CO, think of a CO. Can you picture a CO in your head? What does that CO look like? If you look like the CO in your head, then you possibly have some symbolic capital. So most people, whenever I ask them to picture a CEO in their head, when they describe it, they describe a privileged-looking male in a very nice suit who is white and heterosexual and reasonably, good physique, that kind of thing, able-bodied. So that kind of person in our society has symbolic capital. Other factors important would be ethnicity. Different ethnicities have their own class system as well. Religion, ability, and gender. Some of these things are important to class, and some, people say, are more important than class, as far as inequality is concerned, as far as how we identify is concerned, and of course sexual orientation. Okay, so the consequences of inequality. I was saying before, if you're really wealthy and privileged in an unequal society, does it still impact on you? Now look at this list with individuals. The consequence of inequality in a society on the individual is mental illness, stress, despair, poverty, social isolation and exclusion, stigma, discrimination. Now, not all of these things are only associated with those that are disadvantaged by the inequality. It often affects those that are advantaged as well. And there is a theory in inequality theory called the spirit level theory, and Wilkinson and Pickett came up with it. And what they did was they studied societies that suffer a great deal of inequality within them. Now, America is one of those societies. So although it is rich and powerful country, it has a lot of underprivilege, a lot of disadvantage. There is a huge gap between the rich and the poor in America. And mostly it's economists that do this kind of research rather than sociologists or psychologists or whatever. And so they number crunch, they look at, who has what, who is really wealthy, how many people have over $1 million, how many people own their own home, who are they, where do they live, what are their jobs, and so on and so on and so on. They look at the disadvantage in the community, how many living in housing commission, how many homeless, How many are not earning a living wage, and a living wage is set at a certain amount? What is the minimum wage in that country? In Australia, the minimum wage is a lot higher, over double what the minimum wage in America is. So they will look at all of that. What are the living conditions? How many people live in a house? Is it, a normal 2-bedroom house? Are there just 2 or 3 people living in that house, or are there 6 or 7? That is a form of disadvantage, to live in this overcrowded household. So they basically look at the division between the rich and the poor as well, and then they look at factors like mental illness, stress, feelings of despair, poverty, social isolation and social exclusion, stigma and discrimination. Reports of how many people are visiting the doctor every year for stress, mental illness, and so on. And what they find is, in the privileged population in these countries, there is more mental illness than there is in the privileged populations of countries where there is more equality. So it is affecting the wealthy and the privileged in those countries as well. So really interesting studies, very interesting thesis. Why is the question. Now, if we go to the other side of the page and we look at society, in societies where there is a great deal of inequality, big gap between the rich and the poor, gap in wealth as well as opportunities, income, occupation, all of that, you have a society with more unrest and more conflict than you do in societies that don't have these things. Some of this is going to be around racism, some of it is going to be around religion, sometimes it's going to be, it's not just people who are disadvantaged committing crimes against, crimes of property against people with wealth. It is also that the wealthy find ways of committing crimes against the rest of society. So it's easy to exploit, to take advantage, to have slave labour, to not pay people the minimum wage, and so on. So these crimes are top down as well as bottom up. There's more likely to be political corruption in the government, and also corruption at the level of corporations, businesses. So a lot more crime in these societies, a lot more domestic violence in all classes, in all levels of income. Higher rates of imprisonment as well. So, and this creates fear in the population as well. When there's a lot of crime, a lot of unrest, a lot of corruption, a lot of imprisonment, you get poor social relations, and you don't get mixing between the classes and mixing between ethnic groups and so on. Mixing is good. Mixing, everybody mixing it up, going to each other's festivals, each other's towns, each other's restaurants, all that kind of thing brings peace, brings harmony, right? Okay, so you also get poor education outcomes in countries like this. So the most underprivileged schools tend to have much poorer outcomes. And, be concerned. Australia is heading into this. We haven't been there, but we're heading into this. We have very poor educational outcomes presently. We're getting much more concerns about issues like immigration. And, this leads to more unrest. So we should be concerned. Everybody at all levels of the class system experience poor health in societies where there is inequality. Processes and practices that support discrimination and violence occur. Now, the more we devalue and marginalise a group, the easier it is to commit crimes against them, or to believe that it is okay for them to live in a way that is disadvantaged and unequal. So we have to be very careful about how we devalue and marginalise particular groups, because then they do become subject to these processes and practices where discrimination and violence can occur against them. Think in terms of how the police in the 1970s were started the gay Mardi Gras, basically, because the gay and lesbian community was sick of the police beating them and disrupting their clubs and going in and just bashing people up and taking them to prison. And in those days, gays and lesbians were devalued and marginalised in society, and therefore subject to discrimination and violence, and even laws and legislation was justified increasing the inequality. Surprisingly as well, also environmental issues, and we can probably link environmental issues to that political corruption. Okay, now that was a lot to take in. So we'll just take a breath. And moving on to Karl Marx and the theory of class. Now, sometimes people say, why is Karl Marx still important? Why do people talk about class? The theory of class is no longer relevant to us. Well, I always think that the reason why people still talk about Karl Marx wasn't just because he was a great revolutionary, but, he was a person of the people. He cared about the people. He was privileged himself, and yet he spent his life studying and writing about the plight of the working class people. We come from a feudal system into a industrial system where a lot of people, and this is happening in the third world now, so in that way it's still relevant, people moving from the country where they used to live on farms, tenant farms, so they didn't own those farms, they were tenant farmers. The privileged, the wealthy, often connected to royalty, people owned those farms. Those people often lived in poverty, but through the process of industrialization, they moved to the cities, they moved away from the countries, they stopped being farmers. At that time in history, before the Industrial Revolution was at its peak, most people lived on farms or they worked in service. So there was this massive change where suddenly people were working in factories. Now these factories were unsafe, working hours were long, they were paid quite badly, their living conditions in the cities were overcrowded, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough warmth, they died of communicable diseases, the poorhouses were huge. At the same time, we're having the period of enlightenment, so the issue of human rights was getting on people's agendas. People were thinking, is this right? Is this okay? Should we be doing this? Marx was really concerned about the inequality and how come this inequality was occurring and how was it allowed to happen? How did it happen? What was the system? What was the process? What actually happened? And he blamed it all on the system, the means of production, or the mode of production. How did these, think about the interrelationship between the wealthy and privileged who owned the means of production, the factory, and so on. So they own it, and they get the people to come and work there, and the people produce a product. And that product is sold, and a profit is made on the product. The profit goes to the wealthy, privileged person who owns the factory, owns the means of production, owns the raw product, is able to buy the machines and everything, pays all the people. So they might say pay everybody $100 for the day, and then their profit is $200. So they make $100. And Marx said this was the problem. This was the problem of the class system. And this was the problem of inequality, because the class system allowed what he called the bourgeoisie to make a profit out of the labour of those workers. So the workers sold their labour, so they sold their body, they sold the power of their bodies. And the profit wasn't taken by them, it was taken by the bourgeoisie. Now Marx called this a capitalist system, and within it he said inequality was inevitable. It would never go away. Inequality would never ever go away whilst we had capitalism. He also believed that the working class would eventually rise up against the capitalist system. He said that the bourgeoisie own most of the wealth because they control this system of production that I was just talking about. Because they own it, they're able to make this massive profit. He said the proletariat, now this is the poor working class people, the proletariat, do all the work, and yet it is the rich, the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, capitalist, he called them, who get the benefits. He said that the worker would never get ahead if they did not share in the wealth that they worked to create. So this was basically his theory. He never talked about capitalism. Capitalism wasn't a term in use at the time. He always talked about the capitalist system. And he called those engaged in it, the wealthy, he called them the capitalists. Now, he said the workers were in this vulnerable situation where they would become exploited because they had nothing to sell other than their labour. And they used their bodies to do this. So their bodies were at risk in these factories, from the machinery, from the repetitive tasks, from the heavy physical nature of it. They died quite young. They might die at the time anywhere in between the ages of 30 and 40. Average life expectancy at the time was around 50-ish. It was the rich that lived on till later life. The poor died young. They were at risk of communicable diseases from their unsanitary, overcrowded living conditions. They didn't have any money to start with. They weren't able to go and build their own business, be a merchant, have their own land, to have a farm. They only had their labour power. Now, he argued that wealth that the bourgeoisie had was a product of the labour of the worker. And he very much believed that that surplus profit should be returned to the worker, because they were the ones. But the capitalists have always won in their argument because they were the ones who started with the money. They were the ones able to buy the factory location, to buy the equipment, to buy the raw product and pay the worker. Therefore, they're entitled to the profit. That is the ethos, the philosophy that drives capitalism. If you start out with the bucks, you get the profit. You don't have to share it with anybody. He believed that there was a tangible connection between money and political power. So if you were the elite, and we talked about that the other week, if you were an elite in society, you also had political power. Even if you weren't involved in politics, you have the ability to to manipulate or influence people who did have people who were working in the political system, but also your needs and your wants would drive political decisions. People in politics would be more interested in your needs and wants than in that of the worker. But workers were given a subsistence wage, not a living wage, and the surplus, the profit, was returned to the capitalist. Now this subsistence wage and living wage are interesting. Do you know what a living wage is? Well, a living wage is broken up into certain parts. And you think in those days, often this was a male who was earning the wage, but in the working class, females also worked, and sometimes had to work in the home as well as the same amount of hours as the men. And the wage, a living wage, is supposed to feed you adequately and feed your dependents adequately. It is supposed to clothe you and your dependents. It is supposed to be able to provide shelter for you and your dependents, and education for dependents. And in this industrial period, people were given a subsistence wage, which meant that it didn't pay for adequate accommodations or adequate food for the person and their dependents, and it certainly didn't provide for things like shoes or an education for those dependents. So whilst the capitalists were making a massive profit, they weren't sharing that profit with the workers, and he believed that this was the real problem with capitalism. Now this is why he thought the working class would rise up against the capitalists. He had a theory of class in itself and a class for itself that explained how and why the working class would reject the capitalist system. Now, class for itself would be a revolutionary class. They would do something for itself. A class in itself, you're part of your class, but you don't have a class consciousness or a political consciousness associated with being part of that class. So, if a class was a class for itself, it would have a political consciousness, and it would have a clear consciousness that it was part of a class that was being exploited and disadvantaged, and therefore would revolutionise based on its consciousness of being part of an exploited class. And of course he was wrong, and think about why he was wrong. There was no revolution in the Western world from the working class. We had the French Revolution, but that was pretty much it. Now many people would say that's because the working class do earn a living wage now. They earn more than a living wage in many cases, and that's been brought about not by revolution and not by tackling the capitalist system, but by the working class joining in with the capitalist system and actually being able to access some of that surplus profit. And that was achieved through unionism, through industrial relations that had come to set a minimum wage that would be a living wage, and working conditions, improve working conditions. And that was quite a long process that went on. Now Weber came along sometime later than Marx, and as we can see, with Marx, we have a two-part system here. We have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, we have the rich and the poor, we have the upper class and the working class. Weber came later, and he acknowledged class being a significant issue, and he saw it as quite economic, but he added to it. He he was working and writing at a time where the middle class was more prominent, where it wasn't just the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The class system was more complex. He had a theory of inequality, though, and in his theory of inequality, class was an important part. But his theory was more multidimensional, and he saw class as a source of power, economic power, alongside what he called status and party. Now, these are interesting concepts. Party, remember he wasn't theorizing in English, so our interpretation of our, translation of these concepts is party is political. So what is the political power? And this is not just government. There is political power in other forms. So what are they? So you might see associations as having parties. So clubs, these important elite clubs that gentlemen used to belong to, still do, that through those associations with those clubs, political power could be harnessed, shared, acquired, and so on. And status is, we understand in our interpretation, we don't need to translate it too much. We understand status is privilege, as where are we on that hierarchy? If you imagine that, the hierarchy of social stratification that I showed you in the first slide, where are you on that? Status is higher depending on how high you are on that hierarchy, and it comes for all sorts of reasons. So it doesn't just come because you've got money. It could be that you have some political status. It could be that you derive status from something like being a bishop. So being a bishop, a priest, you don't necessarily have a lot of money, but you do have status. So for Weber, class was still about money, but it's also about the position that we're born into. Because remember, status and privilege is something that we are born into, or lack thereof. So what is our capacity also? So there's that we inherit, and then there's that we can then acquire through our own capacity and our own power. So what is that? So for Weber, class was economic. It was about wealth and income, occupation. Also about those things like postcode. But status could also be about postcode. So status about prestige, honour, esteem. So a high court judge may not have a lot of money, but would have a lot of status, and also a lot of party, which is that political organised power and influence. And as I said, doesn't just come from government, it comes from other places as well. A CEO in a corporation is somebody like Murdoch, who owns lots of media, would have a lot of party as well. So a much more complex system of class. But the most relevant theory, I think, that we have today is Bourdieu's theory of class. I'll skip over Durkheim. I just wanted to mention Durkheim because he didn't, as most functionalists do, didn't really problematize class as an inequality. He saw it as a social order that was needed to keep society functioning. And so anything to do with class that was unequal, such as the division of labour, he said was fair as long as it was transparent and mirror. Now, meritocracy is a very interesting concept, and one that I hope that we talk about a lot in this subject, because do we live in a meritocracy? does merit apply? Is that why we are promoted? Because we had the merit? And democracies are critiqued as not being meritocracies. So I'm just worried about getting distracted here when I'm supposed to be talking about class. So he basically said dysfunction just occurs where there's corruption. And then, of course, this leads to social conflict, unrest. Let's move on to Pierre Bourdieu, a very famous French sociologist whose books were always bestsellers in France. So he extended Marx's theory of class into a much more complex theory. It consists of things such as the field. Now, the field is the environment. It's where things happen. It is the physical world. And I'm not going to talk about it much today, although it's very relevant and important, and if you'd like to read about it in your text, please do. But what I'd really like to focus on today is his theories of habitus and forms of capital, because habitus particularly is associated with the theory of class. What is class to Bourdieu? And you'd have to say, in simple terms, it is the habitus. So what is the habitus? A French word that we can interpret to mean class, but not just in terms of stratification, in terms of what it is and how it occurs, and how do we operate in terms of the habitus that we are born into, that we exist within. And then we're going to go on and talk about habitus a little bit more. And then the forms of capital. Now, how privileged we are, how powerful we are, whether or not we are advantaged or disadvantaged, the opportunities that we have, the resources that we have, Bourdieu said, are all connected to these forms of capital. There's economic, and these exist within our habitus, and our acquisition of them and our ability to have access to them depends upon our habitus. So economic capital is material resources, it's wealth, it's income, it's property. Cultural capital is different. So think about culture, what you know about culture. We know culture is something that we share with one another. If we're part of a culture, we know we're part of it because of the other people that exist within it. We often share language, we share dress, we share leisure activities and preferences, tastes. So if we have cultural capital, again, like economic capital, there can be a hierarchy of cultural capital. So what do we have if we have a lot, if we have wealth in terms of cultural capital? What do we have? Well, we have knowledge. We have knowledge of a lot of different things and deep knowledge of some of them. So we might have good knowledge about how society is organized and how it operates, and through that knowledge we're able to take opportunities. Education is very important. Not just level of education, but type of education. I said before, Harvard and Oxford, most elite universities in the world. So to have an education from there opens doors for you. This is important. Cultural capital. Language. How many languages are you proficient in? Now, any of these things, this cultural capital can then support you in acquiring economic capital. They're all transferable. Social capital, that's like who do you know? So are you a member of one of those elite clubs I was just talking about? Well, that will give you social capital. Through being part of that elite club, you might get opportunities. It might open other doors for you to say to people, I'm part of this elite club. And symbolic capital is status. Do you have respect? Do you have reputation? Are you an important person? Do you look right? Do you have all the right embodied capital? So the habitus, think of the habitus as a way to understand it. Think of it as class. It's a structured system where we acquire and pass on behaviours, values, attitudes, preferences, tastes and dispositions. So we learn them, but it's more than that. We embody them. They become us. We don't have to think about them. We just behave in that particular way. We have a particular belief system. We hold a value. It's just the way it is. So we acquire this from our habitus. So it comes from the people around us. Some of them we know and some we don't. But we learn it. We learn it through language, discourse, the behaviours and actions of those around us. What do we see them choosing in terms of preferences and tastes? How do they consume? What do we see in the shops around us? What is in the houses of the people around us? What do those people talk about? What do they do? This is all in our habitus, and it becomes second nature and not unusual to us. So it's like being part of a culture and not realizing that you're part of a significant and distinct culture because it's so normal to you. So it is all of that on the other side, this structured system as a process of socialization and education and imitation. Think about how a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old learn, you imitate. So it's not so much knowledge acquisition as it becomes who you are. So Bourdieu talked a lot about distinction, that these are the tastes and preferences, the lifestyle ambitions that we have. So cultural capital might be a strong and significant part of our habitus, and it might not be. But the habitus will influence what capital we go after. So do we go after social capital or cultural capital? Or are we just going to go after economic capital? Is that going to be our focus? Is that what we think will be important to us in life? And why? But yeah, distinction was very much about taste and preference, and that is highlighted in the habitus that we are part of as part of our class system. These tastes and preferences are shared. They're part of the habitus. So think about walking along the shops, a strip of shops in a particular area where a particular class of people live. What shops are they? What restaurants are they? Bourdieu, who did huge studies in France over decades, looking at the tastes and preferences of people in certain classes, said that within that habitus we share those tastes and preferences. So what will be in those shops will be according to class. So you can go to different parts of the country to where a particular group lives, and you will have the same shops, the same type of shops, and the same types of restaurants, the same types of cars, and people wearing the same types of clothes, and doing the same types of leisure activities. This is cultural taste. And look, it's crucial to our social relationships. If we are different to those in our habitus, it causes problems for us. We're seen as different. We could be rejected. We learn it, we imitate it, we acquire it from a very young age, and then we reproduce it. We teach it to our children, and those around us see what we do, and so on. So just to recap, social and cultural capital, they're quite important to how we understand inequality, privilege and disadvantage. So if you are disadvantaged and you're living in a housing commission town outside of Campbelltown, which we look at in my social inequality subject, what is your access to social capital in that housing commission estate? What access do you have to networks and support people? In these places there often aren't businesses. There often aren't a strip of shops where there are psychologists working and services, as well as travel agencies and businesses operating and nice restaurants and so on. So the children learning their habitus are not being exposed to those things. So what are they being exposed to? Often there's no shops and services. There's nothing out there. And they go to school, and what do they acquire from the school system? Are they doing music lessons, language classes? Are they going on excursions? Do they go to Canberra for a trip? Do they have an opportunity for some overseas travel in their final years of high school? Do they get taken to classical music concerts, and do they have an opportunity to make a movie, and so on and so on and so on? And so what is their access to the social and cultural capital of the world? So very important to not only the study of inequality, these concepts, but also when we're thinking about gender and ethnicity in the Western world, when we're thinking about ability and disability, when we think about who is privileged and who isn't and why, it's good to try and understand the theory of social capital and cultural capital and symbolic capital. Okay, so that's all I have. I had very limited references this week. You might notice that. Sorry about that. That's all we've got for this week. We're just about to hit the hour, so I should probably leave you alone. Do remember, turn these recordings on and off. Give yourself a little break after 20 minutes and then come back to it. You can always go back and revise, etc. But until I talk to you again, good luck in your studies. Fantastic work on your first assessment, the sociological imagination assessment. And good luck with your studies, and I'll talk to you soon.